First story, The Invisible Superintendent. I never thought I'd leave the city, but when my daughter was born, my wife, Sarah, insisted we find somewhere quieter, somewhere safer. So we moved to Brentwood Condominiums, a small, unassuming complex in New Jersey. From the outside, it seemed like the perfect place for a fresh start. Family-friendly, well-maintained, with just enough green space for kids to run around. But that was before things got strange. The first sign of trouble came about a month after we moved in. Sarah woke me up in the middle of the night, whispering frantically, "I hear something in the walls." Groggy, I listened. At first, it was faint, a soft, scurrying sound, like claws dragging across drywall. It wasn't unusual to have a mouse or two in an older building, but this sounded bigger, more deliberate. The next morning, I mentioned it to our neighbor, Linda, while grabbing the mail. She shook her head and sighed. "You're hearing the rats too, huh? We've been dealing with them for months. Ever since Bill took over as superintendent, things have gone downhill. He's a real weirdo, that one. Never talks to anyone. Barely keeps the place running. I didn't think much of it at the time. Problems with management aren't exactly rare. But over the next few weeks, the scratching in the walls got worse. Soon, other neighbors started complaining. People were finding droppings in their kitchens, pantries raided, and even nests, made of insulation and chewed-up wires, behind appliances. It was disgusting, and no matter how many times people tried to report it to Bill, he never responded. Bill was an odd figure, to say the least. We hardly ever saw him, and when we did, he always seemed nervous, like a man constantly on edge. He'd avoid eye contact, mumble incoherent excuses when someone caught him, and then disappear for days. The few times I approached him about the infestation, he brushed me off, insisting pest control had been taken care of, but the rats kept coming. What made it worse was where the rats were coming from. It wasn't like they were getting in through open doors or cracks in the foundation. No, these rats seemed to be living in the walls themselves, gnawing at the plaster, scratching deeper into the building structure. Sometimes you'd hear them in the middle of the day, like they were tunneling behind the drywall. And no matter how many traps people set, the rats seemed endless. One night, Linda called a last-minute meeting for the tenants. About 10 of us gathered in her living room, the tension thick. "This has gone on long enough," she said, looking around the room. "We need to do something. Bill clearly isn't handling it. Half the building smells like rat piss, and my walls are practically vibrating with whatever the hell they're doing in there." Others nodded in agreement, but no one had any real solutions. Someone suggested calling the city to file a formal complaint. Another person wanted to break into Bill's office to find the pest control reports. But something about Bill kept everyone hesitant, like we didn't want to push him too far. He had that unsettling vibe, like a man harboring dark secrets. A week later, things escalated. It was around 3 a.m. when I was jolted awake by a crash from the living room. I ran out, heart pounding, only to find a large, gaping hole in the wall near the baseboard. Rats, dozens of them, were pouring out, their beady eyes gleaming in the dim light. Sarah screamed as I grabbed our daughter and rushed to the door, kicking rats out of the way as I ran. The hallway was chaos. People were running from their apartments, cursing and yelling, while the rats swarmed around us, moving in organized, terrifying waves. It was like they were being directed. I'll never forget the sheer number of them, their bodies blackening the floor, squirming over each other in a frenzy. By morning, we'd had enough. The tenants demanded an emergency inspection. Bill was nowhere to be found, of course, but we weren't waiting for him. A couple of the guys from the building grabbed tools and started opening up the walls. What we found still gives me nightmares. Behind the drywall, running through every unit, were narrow, crude tunnels. The walls weren't just rotting. They'd been hollowed out, chewed through by thousands of rats. It was like a living network, a hive, with fresh rat droppings and shredded debris lining the passages. Worse, Some of the tunnels led down into the basement, which no one had ever thought to explore. We forced open the basement door, flashlight beams cutting through the thick dust. The smell hit first, damp, moldy, and something else, something rotten. As we descended, we saw the real horror, an underground labyrinth of tunnels, much larger than the ones in the walls. They stretched out beneath the building, expanding in every direction, like a subterranean rat kingdom. And there, sitting in the middle of the largest tunnel, was Bill. He was curled up on the dirt floor, muttering to himself, covered in bites. His skin was pale, his clothes ragged, and his eyes, I'll never forget his eyes. He looked at us, wild and terrified, and whispered, I thought I could control them. I made a deal. But they're smarter than I thought. We tried to drag him out, but he resisted, his eyes darting around the tunnels like he expected something to emerge from the shadows. I promised them I'd keep the building full. He kept saying, keep the money flowing. But I didn't know they'd want more. They always want more. That's when the rats came. They poured out of the walls, out of the tunnels, surrounding us, trapping us. Bill screamed, they won't let us leave. They've sealed it all up. And he was right. Every exit we tried was blocked, filled with rats. We were trapped, just like he said. I don't know how long we were down there, fighting them off, waiting for help that never came. Eventually, the lights went out and the rats, they just kept coming. They're still coming. If you find this, don't come looking for us. Don't come near Brentwood condominiums. The rats, they're in control now. Second story, the abandoned shack. I've been a real estate agent for almost 10 years, and while it's not always glamorous, it's usually predictable. That was before I took the job in rural Virginia, a place so forgotten, even GPS had trouble finding it. The house, a small, decaying shack surrounded by acres of overgrown fields, had been abandoned for over 20 years. A couple inherited it but had never set foot on the property, opting instead to sell it. I was hired to clean it up, list it, and get it off their hands. Seemed simple enough. When I first arrived, the place felt heavy, like the air itself carried the weight of years of neglect. The paint on the wooden exterior had long peeled away, revealing gray, rotting planks beneath. The windows, cloudy with grime, seemed like the eyes of something old and dying, yet watching, always watching. I've seen worse, I told myself, but something was off. There was this smell, not overpowering, but faint, like wet earth mixed with something metallic. It clung to the breeze, growing stronger as I walked toward the house. What struck me immediately was the movement, small, darting shapes in the tall grass. Raccoons? Squirrels? It didn't seem like a big deal, not at first, but then I saw them. Rats, dozens of them, scurrying along the porch, weaving in and out of the wooden boards like they knew the place better than anyone ever had. A shiver crawled down my spine. I don't mind mice or bugs. Comes with the job in old houses. But the way these rats moved, almost coordinated, left me uneasy. Still, I had a job to do. Inside was what you'd expect from a house left to rot. Dust-coated furniture, sagging beams, and the lingering scent of mold. The smell I noticed earlier seemed stronger here, more concentrated, like it was rising from the floorboards. I chalked it up to decay, maybe something dead in the walls or under the house. Nothing I couldn't handle, though. At least that's what I thought. The first few days were uneventful. I cleaned out what I could, listed the necessary repairs, and contacted contractors. But the rats, they didn't stop. Every time I turned a corner, they were there, watching, waiting. I called pest control, but the traps didn't work. No matter how many they set, the rats kept coming back. I swear their numbers were growing, as if they were being drawn to something inside the house. By the third day, I'd had enough. I couldn't shake the feeling that the rats were trying to tell me something, trying to lead me somewhere. I decided to take a look around the basement. The house didn't have a proper cellar, just a damp, dark space beneath the floor accessible by a small trapdoor in the kitchen. It was there that I found the journals. They were old, bound in cracked leather, and tucked away in a corner where the dirt floor had eroded slightly. The handwriting inside was spidery, barely legible, but what I could make out sent a chill through me. The previous owners had left because they couldn't escape the rats. According to the journal, the family had been slowly driven insane by the constant scratching in the walls, the gnawing at their food, and eventually something far worse. The entries grew more frantic, more paranoid. One of the last pages described a smell, the same metallic scent I'd noticed, that seemed to draw the rats from miles around. It wasn't just rot, the writer claimed. Something was buried beneath the house, something that shouldn't have been disturbed. That's when the entries stopped, abruptly. I should have left then. I should have packed my bags and gotten the hell out of there. But I didn't. I convinced myself it was all just the ramblings of someone losing their mind. I even dismissed the warnings from the locals, who had all but begged me to stay away from the house. They spoke of curses, of the land being sick, superstitious nonsense, I told myself. That night, I decided to stay over. I figured I could knock out some repairs early in the morning. As dusk settled, the smell intensified. It wasn't just in the basement anymore. It was everywhere, seeping through the walls, hanging in the air like a fog. Then came the rats. At first, I heard them, a faint rustling, like the soft patter of rain on leaves. But soon it became louder, more frenzied. They flooded out of the walls, from under the floors, swarming in waves. I've never seen so many. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, covering every inch of the ground, the walls, the ceiling. I could barely move without stepping on them. Panicked, I grabbed my things and bolted for the door, but it was like they were hurting me, forcing me back toward the basement. I stumbled down the steps, rats crawling over my shoes, biting at my ankles. I kicked them away as I tore at the dirt floor, desperate to find whatever was buried down there. I don't know why, I just knew I had to. Then I found it, a body, or what was left of one. The corpse was shriveled, mummified, wrapped in a tattered cloth. Its face, what was left of it, was twisted in a grotesque scream, as if frozen in its last moments of terror. The smell was overwhelming now, so thick I could taste it. The rats surged forward, their beady eyes fixed on the body, but they didn't attack it. They circled it, almost reverent. In a daze, I reached out and touched the corpse. The rats stopped, every single one of them. For a moment, the house was completely silent, the air thick with a tension that felt alive. Then, just as suddenly as they had come, the rats scurried back into the walls, disappearing into the dark corners of the house, leaving me alone with the body. I don't know what I uncovered that night, and frankly, I don't want to. I left the house the next morning and listed it for sale. I should have told the new owners, warned them, but I didn't. I needed to be rid of that place, to wipe it from my mind. A few weeks later, I heard from the buyers. They were moving out. The rats had returned, but this time they were angrier, more aggressive. The house had awakened something that wouldn't rest. And I think deep down, I knew that all along. Third story, the canal rats. Started as a routine job, nothing more. I've been a civil engineer for over 15 years, and when I got the call to inspect the old sewage tunnels beneath Chicago, it didn't raise any alarms. The city's infrastructure is aging, and inspections like this are common, especially with the reports of rat infestations becoming more frequent. I'd heard the stories, everyone in my line of work has, but to me, they were just urban legends, passed around by maintenance crews to scare the rookies. Massive, mutant rats? Sure. That was until the disappearances started. Maintenance workers had been going missing for months, and the city wanted answers. Rumors circulated among the crews, claims of strange noises echoing through the tunnels, of shadows that moved in ways they shouldn't. But it was easy to dismiss. These tunnels are disorienting, dark, and dangerous. A wrong turn, a bad fall, it happens. But deep down, I had a gnawing feeling that this wasn't just another case of bad luck. I remember the morning we went down there. It was me, my assistant Jamie, and 3 maintenance guys from the city. Our job was simple: survey the area, assess the structural integrity, and get out. But as soon as we descended into those tunnels, the air felt different. Heavy. The further we went, the worse it got. The sound of rushing water echoed against the brick walls, but beneath it, there was something else. Something I couldn't quite place. The stench was overwhelming, even worse than usual for these kinds of tunnels. Like rot, but different. Jamie commented on it too, her face twisted in disgust as we trudged through the narrow passageways. It wasn't long before we saw the first signs of the infestation. Rat droppings littered the ground, and we could hear the faint scratching of claws against stone, distant but constant. Jesus, one of the maintenance guys muttered. I've seen rats before, but nothing like this. We rounded a corner, and that's when we saw it. The rats. But they weren't normal. These things were massive, easily the size of small dogs, with matted fur and eyes that glinted unervingly in the dim light of our flashlights. They didn't scurry away like normal rats either. They watched us. Are you seeing this? Jamie whispered, her voice tight with fear. I nodded, my heart racing. Keep moving. We need to get to the main junction. The main junction was where the tunnel systems intersected, a massive underground chamber that hadn't been accessed in years. We needed to check for structural issues, but the growing sense of dread told me that wasn't the real reason we were down here. The city knew something was wrong, and we were their guinea pigs. As we approached the junction, the rats became more brazen, darting in and out of the shadows, always watching. I could hear the others behind me, their breathing quickening with each step. Then we heard it, this low, guttural sound that echoed through the tunnel. It wasn't human, and it definitely wasn't any rat I'd ever heard before. It reverberated through the walls, sending chills down my spine. What the hell was that? One of the workers asked, his voice shaking. I don't know, I said, but we need to hurry. We finally reached the junction, and what we saw there made my blood run cold. The chamber was massive, just like the plans showed, but it was what was inside that turned my stomach. The floor was a writhing mass of rats, hundreds, no thousands, of them, crawling over each other, forming piles like some kind of grotesque living carpet. And in the center of it all, there were people. At first, I thought they were dead, but then one of them moved. They were homeless, ragged and gaunt, their eyes wild. They stood in the center of the room, surrounded by rats, and one of them, a man with a filthy beard and torn clothes, raised a hand. The rats stopped, all of them, in unison. We froze. None of us dared move, but my mind was racing. How the hell was this happening? I'd heard of rat infestations, but this was something else, something unnatural. They feed us, the man said, his voice rough and broken. Protect us. Keep the others away. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing. These people, these homeless men and women, were controlling the rats. They were using them. And not just as a deterrent, they were an army. You shouldn't be here, another one of them said. A woman this time. Her eyes were sunken, her voice sharp. We don't want your help. I glanced at Jamie, her face pale. We needed to get out and fast. I took a step back, but the rats moved with me, like they were reading my mind, anticipating my escape. We're sealing this tunnel, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You can't stop us. The bearded man smiled, a slow, sinister grin. You think the city cares? You think they want this getting out? Go ahead, seal it. There's more of us, more tunnels, more rats. That's when I realized we were never meant to come back up. The city didn't want this problem solved. They wanted it buried, and we were the ones who would disappear next, just like the others. Run, I whispered to Jamie. We turned and bolted back down the tunnel, the sound of claws and squealing rats chasing us. I could hear the others behind me, but I didn't dare look back. My legs burned. My heart pounded in my ears. I kept running, navigating the maze of tunnels by memory, praying we wouldn't hit a dead end. We finally burst out into the daylight, gasping for air, our clothes soaked in sweat and grime. We made it, barely. I still have the video. I recorded the whole thing, everything we saw down there. I showed it to the city officials, but they shut me down. Fast. No one wanted to acknowledge what was happening beneath Chicago. They wanted it to stay hidden, kept out of sight and out of mind. The rats are still there. The people too. Growing, organizing, evolving. And the city, they're just letting it happen. But one day it's all going to spill over. I don't know when, but I can feel it. Those tunnels can't hold them forever. The canal rats are waiting, and when they come, no one will be able to stop them. Fourth story, the cursed factory. When I took the job as a supervisor at the old packaging plant in Detroit, I thought it was a step up. I'd heard about the city's revitalization projects, trying to breathe life back into the industrial zones that had been dead for decades. They sold me on the idea that I'd be part of something bigger. Turns out, I had no idea what I was getting into. The factory had been shut down for nearly 40 years, sitting abandoned in one of the rougher parts of the city. It was an eyesore, rusting metal, shattered windows, graffiti everywhere. But my company had bought it for cheap, hoping to turn it into something useful again. My job was simple: get the place ready for reopening, oversee the renovations, and make sure everything stayed on schedule. The first couple of weeks were fine. Workers came in, cleaned out the debris, started replacing the broken equipment. It was the kind of boring, tedious work I expected. But then, one by one, they started calling in sick. At first, I didn't think much of it. This construction work, after all. People get hurt, catch something, take a few days off. But when the second wave of workers started coming down with the same symptoms, fever, chills, nausea, weird bites on their arms and legs, I knew something was wrong. It wasn't until I saw the bites up close that I started to worry. They weren't like anything I'd seen before. Deep, circular marks, sometimes 2 or 3 in a cluster, with the skin around them looking swollen and infected. Some of the guys joked it was a rat problem. Detroit's known for rats, especially in places like this, so at first, I laughed it off. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized no one had seen a single rat since we'd reopened the place. Not even a trace. That's when I started digging through the old records. I figured maybe there had been an extermination done years ago. Maybe there was some chemical residue that was making people sick. I was half right. The plant's original owners, back in the 1960s, had contracted an extermination crew. But according to the records, those guys never finished the job. In fact, they never came back. It was like they vanished into thin air. The company never filed a missing person report, and when the plant shut down a few years later, they just locked the doors and walked away. I should have quit right then, but I didn't. I needed the job, and there was no way I was walking away over some missing exterminators from half a century ago. So, I did the next logical thing. I sent a crew to check the basement and sublevels, thinking maybe there was a nest we'd missed. That was my biggest mistake. The first thing we noticed was the smell. It hit us as soon as we opened the old basement doors. A mix of rot, chemicals, and something else, something foul, almost alive. We descended into the darkness, flashlights cutting through the thick dust in the air, and we found what looked like tunnels, long, winding, and carved out beneath the foundation. At first, we thought it was some kind of old sewage system, but then we realized it wasn't. These tunnels were new, or at least newer than the rest of the plant, and they weren't made by people. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The walls were slick with some kind of oily residue, and the floors were covered in a thick, greasy substance. And then we saw them. Rats. Dozens of them. But these weren't normal rats. They were huge, easily the size of small dogs. Their fur was matted and patchy, their eyes glowing an unnatural yellow in the light of our flashlights. They moved in and out of the tunnels, gnawing at the walls, the floors, each other. I've seen rats before, everyone has, but nothing like this. It was like they were mutated, changed by something in the factory. And when we shined our lights on them, they didn't scatter like normal rats would. They just stood there, staring at us, waiting. That's when I noticed the barrels. Dozens of old, rusted chemical barrels, some of them cracked open, leaking a thick, black sludge onto the ground. The rats had been feeding on it, thriving on it. I called my boss immediately, told him what we'd found, and begged him to shut the project down. But he wasn't interested. Told me it was just rats being rat, and that the factory was too important to the company's bottom line to be delayed. He told me to clean it up and keep quiet. I wish I had. I wish I'd just walked away, but I didn't. I tried to handle it myself. We set up traps, poisoned the water, even hired another exterminator. But nothing worked. The rats kept coming. Bigger, stronger, more aggressive. And then the accidents started. It began with the workers getting bitten. Then people started disappearing. First, it was just a few, but then entire crews went missing. I reported it, but every time I was told to stay quiet to keep the project moving forward. Eventually, the factory reopened. On paper, it was a huge success. The local news ran stories about how we'd brought life back to the area, how jobs were being created. But I knew the truth. I quit a few weeks after the grand reopening. I couldn't stand being there anymore, knowing what was still lurking beneath the factory. Every night I'd lie awake, thinking about the tunnels, the barrels, and those rats, wondering how long it would take before they'd surface again. And they did. Last week, I saw a news report. Workers at the factory had fallen ill, same symptoms as before. Only now the bites were worse, deeper, deadlier. They're not going to stop. Those rats, they've been feeding on something down there for decades. Growing, changing, becoming something else. And now they're out. I tried to warn them. I tried to stop it. But no one listened. I just hope, wherever you are, you're far, far away from Detroit. Because it's only a matter of time before they spread. Fifth story, the House of the Dead. I don't know why we ever thought moving to Salem was a good idea. It was one of those impulsive decisions. Mike and I had been looking for a fresh start, and when we stumbled across the listing for that old colonial house, it felt like fate. The rent was low, the house had charm, and it was in the heart of historic Salem. It all seemed too good to pass up. The first night in the house, though, something felt off. Mike and I were unpacking, and I swear I heard scratching behind the walls. At first, I thought it was just the creaking of an old house settling, but then Mike heard it too. It was subtle at first, like tiny feet skittering between the wooden beams. Probably rats, Mike said, brushing it off. Old house like this? I'm surprised we haven't seen them yet. He said it so casually, but something about the sound unnerved me. It wasn't just that it was constant, but it moved, almost as if whatever was behind the walls was following us from room to room. A few nights later, I saw them. Tiny, black rats, darting across the floor near the baseboards. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, the moonlight streaming through the window, and seeing their beady eyes glinting in the darkness. They'd disappear the second I moved, but their presence lingered. Mike said it was no big deal, just pests easy enough to get rid of, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more. Things escalated when we met Mr. Hanlon, our elderly neighbor. He was one of those reclusive types, always watching from his porch but rarely speaking to anyone. One afternoon, as I was walking to the car, he approached me. "You know about the house, don't you?" His voice was raspy, like he hadn't spoken in days. "Excuse me?" I asked, caught off guard. "That house, the rats, they guard the dead." He pointed a gnarled finger toward our home. Back during the trials, they buried the bodies here. Illegally. The witches, the accused, whoever couldn't afford a proper burial. They were just tossed into the ground. Those rats? They're more than just vermin. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to laugh it off, chalk it up to a crazy old man with too much time on his hands. But something about the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't, made my stomach churn. That night, I had the first dream. In it, I was standing in our backyard. the air heavy with the smell of earth. Around me, the rats moved in perfect formation, weaving between the trees and over the soil like a dark tide. Then I saw them, human bones half buried in the dirt. The rats carried them, piece by piece, until they were no longer rats, but twisted figures, made of bone and earth. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. Over the next few days, the dreams grew more vivid. Every time I saw more bones, more twisted creatures. I started to notice strange patches in the garden, areas where the soil seemed disturbed, as if something had been dug up and hastily reburied. I couldn't ignore it anymore. One morning, I grabbed a shovel and headed to the backyard. Mike thought I was crazy, but I couldn't explain it. I had to know. As I dug, the earth gave way easier than I expected. It wasn't long before I hit something hard. My stomach dropped when I realized what it was. A skull. Mike came running when he heard me scream. Together, we unearthed more bones, fragments of what had once been human. The old man had been right. Mike wanted to call the authorities immediately, but I hesitated. I didn't know why, but a part of me was terrified of what would happen if we disturbed the dead. Eventually, though, he convinced me and we called the police. They came the next morning, bringing forensic teams and equipment. They took the bones, sealed off the yard. It became a whole investigation. For a few days, the house felt quieter. The rats were gone, as if they had vanished along with the bones. Mike thought we had rid ourselves of whatever curse lingered over the place. But then the sounds started again. It was subtle at first, faint, like a distant echo, but over time, it became unmistakable. There was something behind the walls, but it wasn't the rats anymore. The sounds were heavier, slower, like something much larger was moving between the beams. Last night was the worst. I woke up to a deep, creaking groan, like the house itself was in pain. The air felt thick, suffocating, and the temperature dropped sharply. I couldn't move, paralyzed by a sudden, overwhelming fear. The walls were moving. I swear, I saw shadows crawling through the cracks, slithering along the baseboards. I tried to wake Mike, but he was out cold, as if something was keeping him in a deep sleep. Then I saw them, figures not quite human, but shaped from the shadows and dust. They crawled out from the walls, their limbs twisted and broken, their faces a grotesque mockery of what they once were. I'm in the bedroom now, writing this as fast as I can. The noises have grown louder. Scraping, scratching, the sound of nails dragging against wood. They're coming from all sides, closing in. I tried the door, but it's stuck, like something's holding it shut from the outside. I can feel them. They're getting closer, pressing against the walls, waiting. The air is thick with the stench of decay. I don't know if I'll make it out of here. I hear them whispering now, a chorus of voices that sounds like it's coming from inside the walls. I don't think the dead ever left. They were just waiting for someone to disturb their rest. And now they've come for me.